Hey everyone. Earlier today, I got to speak with Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill is a titan in the labor movement, and I was a bit starstruck in the beginning of our conversation. I hope you'll watch to the end, though, because our discussion of racial injustice and political education through the lens of American history is important for everyone to hear. Bill does such a great job of reminding us that our history is an invaluable resource when deciding how we can best move forward, and that the labor movement could better serve its purpose if we talked about it more. As you'll also see, Bill and I talked about labor leaders. A central theme of this campaign is that unions need to be constantly reinventing and being creative. Part of that includes encouraging younger members to step up. That's exactly what we're doing here, and it's so validating to hear Bill confirm that we're on the right track. Enjoy. I have with me today Bill Fletcher Jr. I first sort of met Bill. He didn't know I was there at the Labor Notes conference a couple of weeks ago when we moved to the digital platform, and we talked about the topic of how to speak to your coworkers about Trump. And what I really loved about that session is that we probably in the first third of that session just kind of agreed we are not talking about Trump here. We're talking about this larger 40-year effort. He's the entertainer for this effort, but what we really need to dig into is that motivating force behind him, this organizing or anti-organizing effort that is fueling him. So Bill, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and let us know maybe what you're working on lately.
So, Megan, I'm very glad to do this. I'm Bill Fletcher. I am a longtime trade union activist, writer. Um, I, uh, I became active in social justice when I was in high school and have been so ever since. Got involved in the trade union movement after I graduated from college. Worked for a number of unions, worked for the National AFL-CIO. I also ran an organization called Trans-Africa Forum, which was the main organization in the US fighting South African apartheid. Was a visiting professor at Brooklyn College. And I've written several books, and my most recent book is a novel. It's a political murder mystery called The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And I just completed the first draft of a sequel to that, and I'll probably be working on something else. I'm the executive editor of something called the globalafricanworker.com, which is a web magazine that started entirely volunteer effort, started in August of 2019.
That's awesome. That's so great to hear that your work seems to just constantly and repeatedly take on a grassroots effort, and that's really what we're trying to do with this campaign. Is just kind of go where the majority of our people want us to go. Like a real member-led union is the direction that we're trying to go in, and it's great to see in your work that that is reflected. That seems to me to be the most valuable direction too. So the main topic that we want to talk about today is the intersection of public policy, political education, the overwhelming idea of racial justice that can go in so many different directions here. But really, we are a Minnesota union. We are an overwhelmingly white state, white union, and we feel as a union that we need to be more reflective of the growth that's been happening in our state recently. We want community input, we want community buy-in, we want to be more integrated into our community, and we see that political education is the real way to do this. And I think that was really the spark for me in this session from Labor Notes is there's this 40-year effort that has been a deorganizing campaign to deregulate, to take away workers' rights, and I think that has been more rapidly more rapidly experienced and exacerbated in our Black and Brown communities. You've written a ton on this. A lot of your work is focused on this. I wonder if you could kind of start us out there.
So it's important for us to see, I think, that there was the convergence of two movements. And it's personified now by Donald Trump, but it really was two different movements. So out of the 1964 Goldwater presidential campaign, there was a segment of the political right led by individuals like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich, who were extreme right wingers. And they were vehemently opposed to the reforms that were taking place in the 60s around civil rights, women's rights, etc. And they wanted to turn the clock back. So they were impressed with the emergence of George Wallace and Wallace's racist campaigns. And they decided, after discarding the idea of forming a third party, they decided to enter into the Republican Party and to align themselves tactically with Richard Nixon. And as a way of, who they despised, by the way, they saw him as a liberal. And to use that to push the Republican Party further and further to the right. And they developed a multi-layer strategy that included litigation against various forms of civil rights legislation, an electoral strategy, that was particularly, it began at the grassroots. And they also had a media strategy. So, and actually a fourth one was campaigns like anti-abortion, anti-busing, anti-Panama Canal, a number of things. So there was that movement. That starts like in the late 60s. Then in the 1970s, there's this economic crisis that unfolds in the Western world, and the United States is affected by this. And the economists and various political leaders are trying to figure out how to get out of it. And they gravitate towards something that comes to be known as neoliberalism, not political liberalism. It's like economic policy that calls for the elimination of any obstacle to the accumulation of profits. And it comes to be articulated by Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And these two movements approach each other and converge. They start to overlap, but they weren't exactly the same. And they, through Ronald Reagan and his successors, they ended up pushing the ruling circles of the United States further to the right, which included deregulation, anti-union activities, attacks on the public sector, racial demonization that sometimes was done through code words, as opposed to the blatant things that we see with Trump. So that and then what happens is when Barack Obama is elected president, this drives the right wing crazy, because you have a black guy that's elected. And they mobilize a counter assault, which ultimately brings us to the emergence of Donald Trump. So you're right, it's actually been more than 50 years since this whole thing started. And it's important that we understand the particular dangers and specificities about Trump. But if you don't understand the underlying base, I'll give you an example. These demonstrators that are calling for the reopening of the economy. Why do they have guns? I mean, do they think bullets can stop the coronavirus?
Right.
I mean, what's the idea? But there's a legacy of over 50 years that this is playing upon, which makes for a very dangerous climate.
There's a lot of privilege involved in that too. The fact that a group of men white men can walk into a state capitol wearing armor and machine guns, and the police stand still.
Oh, absolutely. And I've always said that if you want real gun control in the United States, you have to just do one thing, which is arm black people. and there'll be gun control.
Yep.
And that may sound absurd, but if you look at what happened in California in 1967, when Ronald Reagan was the governor, the Black Panther Party had a march in Sacramento with unarmed shotguns. And all of a sudden, there was gun control in California. There is no way that a group of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans could show up at any state capitol with weapons and not get massacred. And afterwards, there would be either silence on the part of gun advocates, as it was in your own state when Mr. Castillo was killed.
Yeah, Philando.
Right. And he was a legitimate gun owner. And the NRA, to my knowledge, never came out and condemned this killing.
Have they come out and condemned any of them?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But I think what was noteworthy here was that he was a legitimate gun owner. He had every right, according to them, to have a gun. So using their logic and their rationales, they should have stepped forward and said, wait a minute, no, this was simply wrong. But they appeared to have taken a pass.
Yeah. And that, I mean, so going back and kind of bringing in some of this history that you outlined for us that I agree with you is so important and foundationary to what we're fighting against now. It seems to me it's the counterintuitive argument that you brought up about if you arm Black people, that's how you get gun control. Why do you think the general anti movement is so much stronger than those aren't the right words. It's not the anti versus the pro movement, but like the group that is so concerned with holding us back, from my perspective, is so much stronger than the group that I identify with that wants to move us forward. And I know that that's a subjective argument, but I think I can look at it from a community perspective and genuinely see that that's going to move all of us forward, where there's this other group that is only specifically concerned with moving themselves forward, right? Is it because they only have to focus on themselves?
Right. You're talking about on a broader issue, not just guns, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. The answer lies in the history of this country. And so I'll give you an example. This is going to sound really bizarre. It might sound bizarre. There was something that was called the discovery doctrine. And it was something articulated by the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British, and the French in time, that basically said that the countries that or the areas that they discovered, using their word, they laid claim to. And that it really didn't matter who was there first. I mean, it really didn't matter that there were people already there. As far as they were concerned, the land was discovered because there were no Europeans there. So when you have the settlement of the Americas, you bring with it a presumption of ownership. And so the settlers come and they basically say, this is our land. The American Revolution, one of the major factors that influenced the American Revolution was the Proclamation of 1763, which was the British, at the end of the French and Indian Wars, said as a deal to the Indians that American colonists could not move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the American colonists wanted to move there, even though there were all of these Indian nations there. But again, there was this assumption that these people that are already there don't matter. Their lives don't matter. This is our territory. That mindset is very much there, and to this day, in terms of who is a legitimate part of this country and who is illegitimate. Now, you add on to that up until about 1975 or so, the living standard, particularly after World War II, of the average working person had been increasing. Now, after 1975, you see it starting to drop, and it looks like the downside of a roller coaster. right? It goes down, it goes up a little bit, goes down, but it never comes back up to where it was in 75. What's happened in that time is that more and more regular people, as their living standard has dropped, they become deeper and deeper in debt, trying to sustain their living standard, and they're getting angry. And this relates to why your point about education. We need to educate our members as to why their living standard is dropping. It's not because of competition with Latino immigrants or an affirmative action program that has brought a little bit of equality when it comes to minorities or women. It's because what we have seen is a polarization of wealth, with the rich becoming much richer, grabbing more and more of the wealth of regular people, crushing our ability to level the playing field. And so we're getting stomped on. Well, in that situation, you can come to a number of different conclusions. One is that you can say, well, if the rich are doing this, then we need to unite against the rich and these corporate barons. Or you can decide that what's really going on is that one's living standard would be better if they could remove all potential competitors. So there's a segment which identifies with the right. It's you see it in the Tea Party movement, Trump supporters, or these people that are walking around saying that the economy should be open now, despite the COVID plague, who are basically saying, I'm being screwed, and the reason I'm being screwed is because of you. You meaning people of color, women, lesbians, gays, etc. And that if I move you out of the way, then I can be restored to the place of comfort that I was in the 1950s. And so you're dealing with an irrationalist impulse. And that's part of what we're up against. And that's why it's really important that in our unions, we have a very frank discussion about what's going on. And that we don't pull any punches.
Yeah, and it's, to me, if I'm a visual person, if I visualize this, it's like wildfire as it spreads, because it's just blind rage that's not really focused at anything specific, just difference from
right.
what those people are. So, our work, I believe, as a union, is to educate people to the fact that everything that you do is tied to public policy. Mm-hmm. And part of this effort has been to disengage people from this process, to disengage them from the political process, so that things can happen sometimes more rapidly, but mostly just in the interest of this one group of people. So what do you think, in your experience, has been the most effective way? What we talked about at Labor Notes is that the diehard Trump supporters are not where we should spend our energy. It's the people who are questioning kind of what's going on. Maybe my Republican Party has left me. What do I do here? What has been the most effective way to organize those people and to kind of welcome them in and show them that education is the way out of this?
I don't know that there's a most effective way, but there are different approaches. So one of the things that I think is critical for unions is to speak truth about what's going on. So we have to have essentially a storyline that explains, because the other side has a storyline. The other side's storyline is very simple. It's basically this, that once upon a time, if you worked hard, you did well. And if you worked hard, your children would do well. And all of a sudden, that's no longer the case. And it's no longer the case because, and then you just fill in the blank, as far as the right is concerned. It's no longer the case because Jews, because of African Americans, or whatever. We have to have a narrative that says that this country has had, from its inception, a very uneven history, one of great heroism and one of great atrocities, of great inequalities and great solidarities. And that the union movement is a movement that's fighting for equity, it's fighting for justice, and that there's different ways of doing that. For example, uh, public sector unions are public sector workers are largely funded through property taxes and sales taxes. And this becomes a problem because property taxes and sales taxes are regressive taxation. They basically end up hurting people in the middle and lower incomes, whereas the people at the top get off scot-free. All right, well then, why aren't the public sector unions engaging in fights around tax reform to change the tax formula in states so that it's not the middle income and poor that are paying disproportionately? Um, we have we when we have issues of inequality, racial or gender, in our ranks, all too often the union doesn't explain the history of it. It's almost treated as this is simply a moralistic issue, as opposed to that the steps that are being taken to deal with inequality are responding to a long-term history of favoritism.
Yeah.
And that nobody likes favoritism. So let's talk about favoritism. Let's talk about who got jobs while other people were excluded. So you've got to lay that foundation for people before you, or in the context of moving any kind of policy proposals. We need to, when we're looking at education, one of the big problems with education is that education is also largely funded on a basis of property taxes, as opposed to a plan that had been moved by former Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. to make public education a constitutional right, thereby putting it in the federal budget so that everyone was entitled to free and equal education. That would change the entire discussion.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a number of things that the unions can be doing right now that address these kinds of structural injustices.
Do you see that happening on a large scale, or do you think that's still lacking largely?
It's very uneven in part because of leadership cowardice. You know, um, we have in the union movement uh, too many leaders that are more concerned about making it to retirement than they are leading struggle. And and I think that we need a different mindset by the leaders. And the mindset really needs to be, if I'm a leader of workers, then I have maybe one or two terms, maybe more, but one or two terms in order to help to raise the living standard and conditions, not only of the members, but of the people that we serve, if you're in the public sector. And that means being creative. It means thinking about the kind of alliances that need to be built that may not have been built. A lot of public sector unions were built in an environment when public sector workers were treated so badly that any level of organization received a lot of public support. But over time, as private sector unions started to be destroyed or decline, there was a crabs in a barrel mentality that began to fester, in which people that were not unionized or were in weak unions started to wonder, well, why are these public sector workers doing so well? Instead of asking why the rich doing so well, they start competing with other workers. Well, one of the things that public sector unions could be doing is always making sure, and some have, like the Chicago Teachers Union, the Milwaukee Teachers Union, the Los Angeles Teachers, UTLA, Los Angeles Teachers Union, and some others, under the rubric of bargaining for the common good, have they not only bargained on behalf of their members, but also sought to bargain on behalf of their constituents, making the concerns of the constituents parts of their demands. Well, that changes the entire dynamic. Now you're talking about a movement. You're not talking about just a constituency group. So there are people that are doing some of the right things. But there's a lot of other leaders that I think we need to encourage to retire. I really just, it's like, thank you very much for your work. And we hope that you really do well on retirement because now is your time to go. Because they're not, it's like in the history of warfare, sometimes you have generals that have for so long fought the last war, they're unprepared for new circumstances. And it's just best for them to leave.
I really love that. I mean, that is the basis of our campaign, right? We have public sector, we have a public sector union, a large public sector union. And from my perspective, and I hope the folks that are volunteering on my campaign, in order for a union to be effective in the purpose that it serves, it needs to constantly be evolving so that it can not fight management, but balance the scales of power with management. And we have seen through the Supreme Court decision, the Janus decision, that the power has tipped too far in management's favor. So I totally agree with you that unions are not the typical type of organization where you should work your way up the ladder and learn the ins and outs of it. I think it's actually quite the opposite, that we need to constantly have fresh new perspectives leading our union so that we can see ways forward instead of, like you said, fighting the last battle and staying focused on that. I really love that.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen the community buy-in support too recently here with our St. Paul teachers. They were fighting their contract for 9 months, and the school district just refused to hear their proposals on mental health in exchange for salary increases for those teachers. And that's, we've just seen repeatedly that community support is kind of the make or break in a union's power. And so that's what we've been trying to focus on in MAPE. I sit on the political council, our statewide political council too, and we've been trying to bring in more people to show that we are, bargaining for the common good. When our union members do better, all of Minnesota does better too. There's the one topic that I would like to dig into, and that is, we've touched on it a little bit, but the demonizing of poverty and race in the name of profit, those two polar opposites there. And the general picture that I'm getting as we're talking about labor history and just the history of our country in general is that we've had this pendulum swinging back and forth. And we have the social movement of the 60s, and we tried to move things this way. And then the response to that was, you're taking all of our stuff, right? We need to move it back this way. How do we get back to a healthy balance here?
I would use a different metaphor.
Okay.
I don't think it's a pendulum. I think it's pushing a rock up a hill. And we're trying to push the rock of social justice up a hill. And that hill itself is very rocky and filled with various chasms. And there are also people on the upper side of the hill that don't want the rock pushed. And so we have a country that was founded on an original sin of slavery and the extermination of Native Americans. Now, one of the things about this is that when you look at the original 13 colonies and the legacy is through today, the Africans that were brought over in the 1600s, the majority of them in the beginning were indentured servants. They didn't come over voluntarily, don't get me wrong. They didn't come over as slaves, they came over as forced labor. And after 7 years, they could become free. In the mid-1600s, this changes into slavery for life for people of African descent, and then slavery for the life of themselves and their children. And it's in that context that race, as we've come to know it, emerged. Now, why did that happen? It wasn't just an accident. It was a direct result of the colonial elite having a problem of keeping the working people under control. And that when you had all of these forced laborers, Irish,
Italians.
You know, yeah, well, the Italians hadn't gotten here yet, but like in the 1600s, like particularly
Mm.
the Irish and others, um, and the poor English actually, alongside Africans, these groups were frequently joining hands and fighting against the colonial elite. Colonial elite needed a mechanism to break that unity. And they also needed a mechanism to justify bringing over millions of people as forced labor. And that's where this issue of race becomes important. It's not like just something that people were taught. There were laws, there were regulations, etc., that were aimed at driving a wedge and defining who was white versus who was black. We have been living with that since. And unfortunately, in our union movement, there is a reluctance to talk about that. And there is this fear among far too many leaders that if you talk about race and racial injustice, that white people are going to run out of the room screaming, and you'll never see them again. Now, my experience is that that normally doesn't happen. And that but that if you root the discussion in history and explaining how this thing came about, that there's a light that goes on in the eyes, you can see it. And people are saying, wow, you know, some people, when they hear this, they get scared because they realize that their ancestors were played for chumps. And sometimes you can get really upset about that and upset at the wrong people. But other times it's like a revelation. So we've been pushing this rock up a hill, and various people have been pushing that rock. And it's never easy to get it up the hill. But one of the mistakes that was made in the late 60s, early 70s, is that some of the people that were pushing the rock up the hill at a certain point thought that they could rest, that they had found a landing. They could stop pushing the rock up a hill for a while. They knew it had to go farther, but they could rest. Other side never rested. And they did whatever they could to push the rock back down. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes harder when you're fighting against gravity. And that's a lot of what we've been doing, because the people pushing the rock down the hill are very well funded. They have resources we will never have. And so we have to have a different mindset. It's going to necessitate a lot more people to push that rock back up and to push it over the people that are trying to push it down on us.
And probably a little bit for us to get back to our agitating roots as labor unions.
That's right.
To not let this one side pull us farther to theirs, maybe be willing to have these hard conversations and upset some people.
Yeah.
For the purpose of the greater good.
No, absolutely. And one of the things, because I do a lot of discussions about race, and I try to make it clear, particularly to white people, that I'm not interested in white people feeling guilty. You weren't here in 1862 when the Homestead Act was passed, and the Midwest was open up basically to white settlers. You weren't here. And you weren't here in 1919 when the Red Summer happened and there were these pogroms carried out against Black communities. So I'm not asking you to feel guilty. What I am saying, though, is that you can't just say, well, I wasn't here, so I have no responsibility in correcting the situation. No, that's where it's wrong. You absolutely have a responsibility, in the same way that if I was living in a house that was purchased by my parents through ripping off people in my neighborhood, I couldn't just sit there comfortably and say, hey, I didn't do it. You know, the question is, well, yeah, maybe you didn't, but what are you going to do now?
Right.
Are you going to remain silent about the fact that your parents ripped off the rest of the neighborhood? Are you going to try to correct the situation? And that's what the fight around racial justice has to be understood. It's repairing the damage and making sure that the institutions that carried out the damage are removed or thoroughly reformed.
Yeah. Moving to the equity movement rather than the equality movement that we focused on for far too long. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's reparations, repair. I like the notion of repair,
Yeah.
repairing the damage.
Yeah. And I think all of us in labor unions are in a reparative phase right now after the Janus decision. We all have to figure out a
That's
new
right.
way forward.
Mhm.
Bill, this has been a fascinating conversation. I could talk for hours and hours about this. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much and good luck.
Thank you. You too.